All right. Well, today we are blessed to have with us Sam Heath from Equal Justice USA. I think your title is manager. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Manager of this organization. We're going to be talking a little bit about the organization itself, but most especially about their work around restorative justice and seeking to end the use of the death penalty. So, Sam, let's just start with a little bit of a background on your organization. What's the mission of the group? What are you all about? What's the history?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Thanks for having me. So my quick spiel, if I'm at a conference and I have you for 30 seconds, I often say Equal Justice USA, that we're a national nonprofit and we do work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And so we talk about those three things, and I name those are the issues that we engage, and then we engage them with a certain posture. And so if someone doesn't run away, then we get a little deeper and talk about, we want to help others think about when violence, harm, or crime happens, how can, rather than responding with punishment, which is our usual response, especially if we're talking about the criminal legal system, how can we respond with a posture of healing? And so one way is ending things like the death penalty, and another is building things like restorative justice and community safety. And so there's about 50 of us that are within the organization. And my specific role, we're not a faith-based group, but my branch of EJUSA is that I'm the manager of our Evangelical network. Okay. And so my job is to engage people of faith, especially Christians and especially evangelical Christians.
And when was the organization founded?
So we got started in the early 90s, the same year that EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's organization began, which is one of many reasons why we get confused. But so we've been around for several decades, but the initial focus of EJUSA was only and largely on the death penalty. In the 90s, death penalty support was huge. The peak of executions was in 1999 with 98 executions that year. And so that was the main thing that EJUSA engaged. And then around 2010, there started to be a broadening of the work as we thought through, well, if we end the death penalty, which would be wonderful, what do we replace it with? If we're saying punishment doesn't work and doesn't change hearts and help and heal, then what does? And then that began the year's journey into, well, what is restorative justice? What does community safety look like? And so that's now the broad work. So we talk sometimes about the arrows. The down arrow is ending things like the death penalty or things that hurt and harm. And then the up arrow is how can we grow and build community safety in their response to harm?
So let's look at those two dimensions then. You framed it as the things that we want to get rid of and then the things that we want to take on. Let's start with the things that currently exist, in particular the death penalty, that your organization feels are not a good way of approaching justice. Why is that? What's the argument that you all make to, and maybe especially Christian communities when you talk to them?
Yeah, it's what drew me to EJUSA. If you go to our website, ejusa.org, at the top there's a button that says, what is justice? And it's a page that goes through and says what our culture says justice is, and then what we would say it really is. And I'll say what that is in a second, but I read that whole page years ago. I've been with EJUSA about 3.5 years. Before that, I was a high school history teacher for 10 years. That was my background before this work. But as I read that page, I realized everything on there I believed, but I believed it and my road to it was specifically as a Christian, even though that wasn't part of the faith work at all. And so I was thrilled of, I can come here, I can do this, I can talk about these things. But there's a common grace aspect of justice that I think all at EJUSA can come around. But then, like you're saying, there's some unique pieces about Christianity that I think really deepen and make it richer. So we would talk about that the criminal legal system, and by that I'm talking about police and prisons and anything that we think of when we think about public safety, the whole criminal legal system and all parts and pieces of it, say that they're bringing three things: safety, healing, and accountability. And those are the three things I think that we often expect police and prisons and the system and lawyers to be able to bring us. And the argument that we would make, and there's great graphics for this, if you see that on the page, is that that's not actually what is brought. The vast majority, not vast, but more than half of violent crime goes unreported. And that's just one piece of it. So the majority of violent crime that we know and that happens in the nation doesn't even make it into the system. And those pieces that do, when something happens to it, if you want something like prison or even with execution, it narrows down. So something happening is actually pretty rare. So to claim that safety and that healing and that accountability happened, it's not what we actually see happening with the system, especially with the healing piece. The system has largely at its disposal tools of punishment. We can put you in jail. We can put you in prison. We can execute you. Sometimes in the system, there's programs and pieces and parts, often though those aren't intended. The system by design is largely meant to confine, to isolate, and to punish. And so what the system says that it does, safety, healing, and accountability, I don't think that it does that. And so then we've got to look to, well, where is that happening? And we see that happening in lots of places and pockets all over the country, all over the world, largely when communities, local places and spaces take that posture I said earlier and ask the question, rather than when harm happens, what law was broken and who should be punished, they start to shift to what harm happened and what does healing look like? And when you ask that question, especially outside a system that's bound by rules and regulation and is really cookie cutter, you can be really creative in how you respond to it. That's kind of the broad common grace answer.
Yeah.
The piece that I layer on that I think is beautifully Christian is I don't think that the Bible teaches that punishment changes hearts. I think we see violence in the Bible. I think there is a judgment at the end of time. I think the death penalty was part of the Commonwealth of Israel in the Hebrew Bible. All of that is true, but I think when Jesus comes, that changes everything for us here. And I think what Jesus does, one thing that he does on the cross and with the resurrection, shifts what we're called to do as Christians. It shifts what we're called to call on government then to do. So it doesn't take the death penalty and remove it completely in the sense that, again, I think there's a judgment. I think there's an end of those things. But what are we called to do here and now? And so as I see, how does God engage his people? How does he change people over time? It's heart change over time. Now, accountability is usually synonymous with punishment, right? I think if Batman says he's going to hold you accountable, it's not good news. He's not going to sit and talk to you. It's intense. So real accountability, though, is something different and deeper. And it's something that can happen in lots of spaces, but I think can especially happen for Christians. An acronym, this helps me, this is the former teacher in me, is what really helps me remember what we would say accountability is, of ARC or ARC. Real accountability isn't punishment, because that can control people. I don't think that can change people's hearts over time. But real accountability, it's three things, ARC. It's acknowledging the harm, it's repairing the harm, and it's changing things so that the harm can't happen again. You can do those things in a secular common grace space, but you can especially do them when you talk about the work of the Spirit. Let's look at what Scripture says. And so think of those three things, though, and how rarely they happen in the courtroom or the criminal legal system as a whole. The whole system is designed for, if you do something, for you not to acknowledge what you did, and for you either to obscure it or for you to even lie about it. Because why? You fear punishment, rightly so. That's what the system comes. But actual acknowledgement, saying, I did this to you, and I see the effect it had on you, often for victims or survivors of violence, harm, or crime, often that's all they want, is just acknowledgement of what happened, and the system won't allow for it. The R is repair, some physical act. Again, the system has at its disposal only confinement, prison, execution. None of those really repair. They continue the cycle of violence. But the repair is very rarely in the system dictated by the person who was harmed. There's laws, there's mandatory sentencing. That person doesn't get a say, and this is actually what healing would look like to me. And so real accountability is saying, what is it you need? Violence is off the table, but what is it that you need for your healing? And then to see the change is what needs to change in the world, in our lives, in our system, in our household, so that harm can't be repeated. All three of those things that are actual accountability are almost by their opposite negated by the system. And so by the system's design, I would say it's not able to change someone's heart over time. And so we've got to look at other places where that can happen.
And you know what's interesting about that, Sam, is that if you think about the language that we use with regard to incarceration, we use language that's actually about repentance and reparation, but your claim is that that's not happening, right? So we call prisons penitentiaries. Well, that just basically means this is a place where you can examine your sins. It's a very sort of Christian idea. Examine your sins, your wrongdoing, come to a change of heart, change your ways, right? We talk about rehabilitation is the word that's often thrown around with regard to our prison system. And we're told, at least, that there are programs in prisons for people to kind of move them forward in life. But it sounds like what you're saying is that while there may be good intentions there, that's not really what's happening. At the end of the day, it's about confinement and punishment. Is that right?
Yeah. Prisons are a modern experiment. Prisons are not something, the way that we've designed them, are not something that existed throughout the vast majority of human history. Even if you look at the Old Testament, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, when someone was placed in prison, it was until they were able to do something, until they were able to pay their debt. Or you see within the Mosaic Law, all of those laws, if someone did something, there was an immediate response to it. Sometimes it was intense, but if you look at the full Mosaic Law as a whole, the big goal was actually one of restoration. How do we right or bring balance back to this wrong that was done? Prisons, though, don't do that. That was the intention. You might have heard often the difference of intent versus impact.
Right.
I was talking about this with one of my kids recently. I said, you intended for this to be kind. The impact was, I was really upset. So same thing with prisons. I mean, they began with Christians in the 1700s in Pennsylvania, and they were called penitentiaries because they were meant to be based on the idea of the monasteries in Europe. You sit there in your cell as a monk.
This is where I get solitary confinement.
This is where it comes from.
Right.
And the idea was, if I sit there long enough, something's going to happen to me, and I'm going to think about this. And now we know that prison, and especially solitary confinement, does the opposite. It makes everything worse. And so now we've gone through a couple hundred years of this, and we know that prison doesn't work. If the goal is heart change over time, if the goal is just to punish them, it's the most efficient system in the world. And so by design, we have to question, is it doing what it really was intended to do? Initially, it was Christians wanting people to change. But now within our nation, when we say we know prisons don't heal, and people say, well, we still need them, well, now we've moved into the actual impact, and it just seems to be one of punishment. And then that's a deep discussion of, well, what's your theology of punishment? What role does or should that play in our society?
Yeah, let's look at that a little bit more. You are obviously coming at this issue from a Christian background. I think probably also from an evangelical background, it sounds like, as well. And you articulated kind of a core Christian teaching. Some may even say the core essence of the gospel, which is that we are saved and redeemed not by our own good works, but by coming to repentance and accepting the free gift of salvation in Jesus Christ, all summed up in the word grace, right? So it sounds like you're arguing for sort of a more gracious approach, if we could, to how we think about criminal justice. How would this work? So let's get into sort of the restorative justice part. And I imagine that as you talk to people, particularly people maybe in the evangelical communities, you get some pushback on all of this. Is that right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you connect the dots for people, and what do you offer them as a vision for an alternative?
So my background is I grew up in the Southern Baptist church world in North Carolina, and then was in the Presbyterian world for about a dozen years. And then a few years ago, my family and I helped start an Anglican church, one of the two new Anglican plants in Charlottesville. And so my arc of liturgy has been increasingly more liturgical. But yet how I'm talking about these things in the world, and I hate the left and right distinction, has gotten further the other way, which is funny. But yet what I've seen as I've gone through all of these things is that question that you're hinting at as you summarize what the gospel is. What is it that really changes people? And it's fine if you don't know the Enneagram, but I'm an Enneagram 1, which means I can be really intense, really logical, really practical. And as I saw what we're doing isn't working and something else seems to be, then it starts to grow. So but before saying kind of what that alternative looks like, just keep in mind the scope and scale of the system so that we know what we're starting with. I described a little bit the criminal legal system, but it's massive. At our peak in our nation, it was in the 1980s, we had 2.3 million people in prison, which is the most per capita of any civilization in the history of humanity. Now we're just under 2 million, which is still more than anybody else right now. We've got about 1 million police officers, over 2,300 jails and prisons, not counting juvenile detention centers or centers for immigrants spread out all across the nation. The closest I think of which to this spot right here is the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, which tripled its capacity a few years ago and got close to 600 people, and through a lot of effort has been whittled back. But this system is massive when we compare it to other places and spaces. We spend untold amounts of money on it, and we know that there are disparities within it. We often know that those that go within the system, especially those on death row, are those that just can't afford to do anything else. So we know there are disparities with socioeconomic status. We know there are disparities by race. 40% of people on death row are people who are black, when they make up only about 13% of our population. So either something's wrong with black people or something's wrong with the system. So by lots of measures, the system is big and the system has disparities, and it doesn't seem to be doing what it originally was trying to do. So then what do we do? The first response, I think, is to see the system for what it is. It's this big thing that's working really hard and that we're spending untold amounts of money on and putting effort into. And yet we know by any measure other than punishment, we know it's not working. We know it's not bringing healing. We know it's not increasing mental health. We know that it's not done fairly. And we don't have to, but if we get to the death penalty, it's the easiest thing to measure. Right. That the 6 big arguments for the death penalty, we know are not there or real, unless someone wants someone to be punished. So if someone's willing to think, maybe if someone does violence, harm, or crime, and someone has experienced violence, harm, or crime, there's healing that needs to happen on all sides. Hurt people is a phrase that you might have heard, but often people add on to that, but healed people heal people. And when you get in a room with someone who's done harm and someone who's experienced harm, those lines between quote unquote victim and offender get really blurred because you just start seeing a lot of trauma. Those lines aren't unimportant. They are, but you start to see that everybody has experienced something. No person's violent act comes without some violence or trauma having happened in their life. So it begins with asking the question of, is what we're doing working? Yeah. And then my response would be, well, working for what? If it's to heal, no. If it's to punish, then it is. But if we don't just want to punish, then what we need to do is think about what needs to happen. And so again, back to the art, the acknowledge, repair, and change. Ideally, what we want to see happen, and this is what restorative justice looks like in its purest form, is when violence, harm, or crime happens, to be able to have those parties involved. Picture a triangle. So there, in any instance of harm, there's always 3 groups or parties involved. There's the person who did the harm, the person who experienced the harm, and the surrounding community. Often that's like the mediator, the person who's coming in to represent the community. But what you want to have happen is those individuals to sit down in a room, to have the person who did the harm feel safe enough to acknowledge what they did without fear of death or imprisonment, for the person who was harmed to be able to say, here's what I need, here's what my act of repair would look like. And then for all 3 parties to agree to see, here's what the change can look like so we know this won't happen again. And violence, again, it's off the table. And what we see all over the country and all over the world and throughout history, because restorative justice is very much not uniquely American. It's largely based in indigenous practices, and it's built into the Hebrew Bible. What we see, and I keep talking about common grace, because of common grace, is when you set up conditions for image bearers within a space, most often they rise to that occasion. Most often the person who did that harm feels that weight or that godly sorrow that Paul talks about and acknowledges what they did. And the person who was harmed is able to name what they experienced, and they're able to come to some kind of agreement. Now, does that always work? Does it always look that way? No, but I think kind of 2 things with that. One, again, we know what we're doing right now isn't working, so we need to try something else. Imagine if we applied that kind of model to every instance of harm that happened, not only how much we'd be healing, but how much we'd be preventing in the future. But again, I'm a Christian, so I think that sin is within the world. It's here until Jesus comes back, and I think that people and systems are broken, and all of that's true. So I don't think that restorative justice is going to eliminate violence and sin in the world. I think it will change things. And I don't think necessarily it's going to, quote unquote, work for each situation. But what I want is for us to have a response to violence, harm, and crime that always has a hand out to someone, that always says, when you are ready to meet certain conditions, when you're safe to yourself and others, when you are ready to enter into the space of grace you talked about and acknowledge what you did, we are here. And even if we talk about church discipline and Matthew 18 and all of that, I think at the end of the day, that passage isn't about excommunication. It's about certain conditions for community, but the hand is always out. When you're ready to meet these conditions, we want you to return. And those conditions are for that person's good and everyone else's.
Let's summarize some of the key themes there. As you've said, I think a lot that's quite important. By common grace, I assume you mean the basic idea that God is at work in every aspect of life, whether you're Christian or not, and even people who are outside of the church can be transformed by God's grace. Is that?
Yeah, the rain falls on the righteous and the wicked.
And then Matthew 18, of course, is where Jesus talks about church discipline, and the basic idea being that if you have an issue with your brother or sister, you don't just sort of expel them or punish them on the first go-round, right? What you do is you try to reconcile the relationship, and reconciliation is at the heart of the Christian life, right? Jesus we have been reconciled to God through Christ, and we are meant to extend that reconciliation to others. One example of this that I know, and maybe there are others, is the work that was done in South Africa after the end of apartheid. And Desmond Tutu, of course, was an Anglican archbishop, so part of our tradition, and he was involved in this, the truth and reconciliation work that was done there. And I think that in many ways embodied what you're talking about, right? Having the perpetrator, the victim, the community there, and a space in which punishment wasn't the goal, but reparation and reconciliation. How might that work in our community in a sort of concrete way? I'm sure you've thought about this. Maybe you could even zero in on kind of Albemarle County in this area. What would be the structure of that? What would be the institutions? How do you see that working?
Yeah. A few ways, I think, of what it could look like. One, you talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission within South Africa. Rwanda did something similar, and that was a system-wide thing that the government had a role in, which is incredible because it applied to so many. And because it was at such a big level, there were problems with it too. But yet, something like that's almost unprecedented. And that's a big scale thing. Another piece that you could do is think about within an area, like you said, like maybe Albemarle County. Mm-hmm. Another piece to zoom, which we'll talk about, you could zoom in more and think about your church community. And then you could zoom in more and think about your household. And each of those has the same idea broadly and then specific nuances. I mean, the same idea broadly is what restorative justice is. When there's harm, that calls for repair. And you create conditions for the harmed party and the individual who did the hurt to be in a space and to talk in a safe way about what does healing look like for everybody involved. And so to really zoom in, like within our home, and as parents, we're new to this. I believed in a restorative response to violence, harm, and crime in society for years before I applied it and thought about applying it to my household. And so restorative parenting is just a few years, very new territory. And there are very, very few Christians. There's lots of people who aren't of faith, but there are very few Christians talking about restorative parenting for lots of reasons, probably.
But bring you back to talk about that.
Yeah, right? That's something we're trying to figure out as we go. And my oldest is here and can tell you maybe how we're doing. But when something happens in any space, especially if it's within a home, someone does something, it calls out for repair. It calls out for some act of response. And so one, you want to make sure individuals are safe, and then you want to talk through, when someone's emotionally ready, what does repair look like here? That can happen in any sphere. It can happen at your job. It can happen within a church, in any space. So I think it begins often within a household, because you're going to have harm all the time because we're humans and we have conflict. If you think about it within a church, that's really key to think about as well. At a church, I think it can also get a little more formal. Our church is going to have a local group come in and help teach us about what restorative justice looks like. So Charlottesville has a restorative justice diversion program called CVCJ, or Central Virginia Community Justice. And they do restorative justice diversion in partnership with the Commonwealth's attorney of Charlottesville City and Albemarle County. And so what happens is when there's some crime, those two attorneys, Jim Hensley and Joe Platania, look at the cases and say, ooh, I think this is a good candidate for restorative justice. And so they refer it to CVCJ, and then they go through the process, which is just what I said. They meet separately with the parties to make sure that they know the needs and they're safe. They bring the parties together. They come to an agreement. If it's met, they go to the judge, and that's it. And then it's all done. And so we're having them come into our church to say, here's what restorative justice looks like. Here are some principles of it. And here are some ways that it could look in your church, which one I love because we're getting local help. But it's really interesting that we have to, as Christians, have an outside organization that's not faith-based come and help teach us about restoration. Again, I'm thankful, but I'm also like, man, we should be the experts on this. It's okay that we're not. Again, common grace. I'll take help from wherever it is. So we're trying to think about what does it look like for us to, when harm happens, to have this posture or reaction of repair rather than anything else. And so you can actually be trained in this. And there's not one way that this looks. It's not that it always has to be your pastor in the room and done in this exact way on church grounds. This can be done informally. This can be done over coffee. This can be done with friends. Again, think about Matthew 18. It begins with an individual, and then it's others, and then it's church-wide. Like you bring in the help that you need. So there's lots of layers of how this can look. There's organizations that do this formally and that can help do other trainings, but there's other ways it can look within a church or a household.
Now, this sounds wonderful, and certainly in line with the Christian emphasis on reparation and reconciliation in Christian life and in communities. But it does strike me that, and this is just rooted in my experience in parish ministry and life experience, there are some challenging forces in human nature, especially that push against what we're talking about here. So one is, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, when people have conflicts, let's say in a church, often people will not maintain the relationship and try to repair it. They will simply cut off relationships with that person or with a community. This is not uncommon. And this happens not just in churches, it happens in all sorts of groups, happens even in families, right? People biologically related to one another saying, I don't want to have anything to do with you. So there seems to be something in kind of our human nature that doesn't want to engage in this work and would rather just say, you know, you're on my blacklist here. I'm never going to talk to you again. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. And part of that may be trying to resist doing the introspection that would have to be a part of restorative justice. People are reluctant to face their own brokenness and repent, right? That's a challenge too. So how would you address that? I'm really struck by the application of this to other levels beyond the criminal justice system. How would you address that tendency? What you're talking about feels almost counter to our nature in many ways, and in some ways countercultural. I'll say one last thing about that. When I read articles about people who have committed crimes, almost always there's somebody that says, and I would like this person punished. So there seems to be an inclination to punishment, right? Maybe that's just the culture we've been raised in, and that's what we assume is the way to do things, but that's the language that we go to straight away. So how do we deal with that as Christians and as people trying to change the system? How do we respond?
First, you acknowledge that desire. If someone wants something done, that's right and that's good and that's God-given. So for someone to say, I want that person punished or I want that person executed, at the core of that is a cry and a thirsting and a yearning for justice. And that's good. But because we are human, not only are we image bearers, for those of us that are Christians, we have the Spirit, but we're also stuck in original sin.
Right.
And so all of that gets mixed together. And so we need sanctifying processes and people and help to be able to even help us know often how to feel.
Yeah.
We say to our kids often, you cannot control your feelings. At best, you can regulate them. And that's the goal over time. So when we respond to something or we see an injustice, we should want there to be something done. My pastor, his name is Claude Ocho of Church of the Resurrection. He also wrote a book called Reading Black Books, which looks at some books in the past 100 years by Black authors, but reads them with a justice lens. And he says in this book, and I love this, that when Christians see injustice, we should feel anger and indignation. There should be a righteous anger when we encounter injustice, either when we see it or when we experience it ourselves. So I begin by saying, yes, what you're feeling, the root of it, you want something done. There has been an imbalance. Let's acknowledge that and recognize it. But yet, what then do we do in response to it? What actually will satisfy that desire? Well, you have a host of people who aren't even Christians who have called for the execution of the person who murdered a family member, who will time again and again and again say, it happened and I felt no better. If anything, I felt worse. You always will find the attorney who will be able to show the family member saying, I want this person brought to justice, maybe an execution. But you talk to them after, and almost everyone, nothing has changed, or it's worse. So even the most extreme punishment that we have, which is death, doesn't seem to satisfy that for humans. Keep all of that in mind with the idea that we cannot demand accountability. I cannot force you to be accountable. Accountability is something that you offer. It's something that you bring. And there have to be certain conditions where someone feels safe when they've done harm to where they're ready to step into accountability. So we could hold all of that together. Somebody sees injustice, they get upset, they want something done. We know that as humans, we cannot force accountability, that it's something that has to be brought.
Yeah, and one key element I think you're highlighting for us, Sam, is the importance of examining your feelings. And it seems to me that one of the messages that we sometimes receive in our society is that, well, if you feel a particular way, then that's good and right, and you should follow those feelings. Rather than questioning, well, are my feelings in this situation a good guide to what is right and moral and just? And you're, I think, advocating for more introspection and reflection. Just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that you should do it. And you often find, as you're saying, that after you act on that feeling, you realize, hey, that's not actually what was best for me. Something, my deep yearning and longing hasn't been satisfied.
Right. Feelings are a clue, or I've heard some say that feelings are a barometer. They're a piece of data. They're a piece of information amongst other things. They're something that if we prioritize above all else, that's not good news. We're cautioned against a lot of that in the Bible. But feelings are also God-given. Again, we say to our kids often, like, feelings as a whole are pretty neutral. Like, they're not good, they're not bad, they're not evil or wicked. They just are. And you usually can't control your feelings or your emotions.
Right.
Now, where I think Christianity goes deepest is it doesn't often talk about emotions or feelings as much as desires.
Yeah.
That is something that we can shape. That is something that we have community in liturgy. It's why we're commanded to go to church, one of the many reasons, so that our heart's desires can be changed. Right. And out of our desires then come feelings. And so you shape those feelings and reactions, emotions over time by targeting the actual core of a human, which is the heart and their desires. And it takes community, it takes scripture, it takes the Spirit, all those spiritual practices to be able to do that. There's ways that you can shape a heart, again, beautifully in non-religious contexts. And a lot of restorative justice happens there. But Christians, how much more so should we be doing it and able to do it with all of those pieces to see the fullness of humanity and what we know humanity needs.
And you're channeling Jesus very much there when he talks about how the heart is the source of how we live and act and so forth, and that we need to engage in that work of being formed in our heart to love God and love our neighbor. One reality along those lines that I've experienced in my own life, and maybe you have as well, is that when you internalize the grace that God has shown you in your own life, when you're willing to kind of face your own brokenness and be open to God's love for you, it's remarkable how that transformation of your heart then manifests in being more gracious and loving towards other people, right? But it starts with really being attuned to what God has done for you. In the Anglican tradition, we talk about how a true and lively faith, as Thomas Cranmer said, naturally manifests itself in good works and good fruit. And I think for us as Christians, that's maybe part of how we can shape people, is really return to the gospel, return to the good news, and that's what's going to help you go out in the world and live differently and look at the world differently.
Yeah, you said it, of love God and love others. And that order is really key.
Yes,
it's not
right,
love
right.
others and love God. I mean, the
Right.
first 4 of the 10 Commandments are about loving God. The latter 6 are about loving others. There's a reason that order is there. Your heart's desire is formed first by loving God. And out of that then flows the love for other people.
Wonderful. Well, let's, Sam, let's open it up to questions. I'm sure we have questions from the group. Yes, in the back, Bird.
Enjoyed your example of restorative justice and what community and so I was curious if that happened once or twice or did it work, and I think it would be a growing phenomenon. So I really like the practicality locally. Expand on.
Yeah, what has been the consequences of this effort?
Sure. So specifically, and I love that we get to use the local example, Central Virginia Community Justice began about 2.5 years ago or so. And it was a few years in the making. Early on, I was on the board for it and helped shape it because as a Christian, I thought, this is great. This is what we're talking about. And I really wanted to bring churches in to support it and to see what this was. So they just put out their impact report from last year, and there were dozens of cases that they involved. It impacted about 70 people, and they've got plenty of capacity to grow. It's solely a question of resources. If they were given $2 million and 50 more staff, there's need to be able to fulfill it. So there's a higher need and call for restorative justice than there actually is available people to be able to do that. So in our local community, it's thriving. It's kind of taxed to the end of their ability. But they also go and they do trainings. I partner with them. We do reflective jail tours at the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail every April at the Tom Tom Festival. We take people to the jail to see it. And then we go to a room after, and we actually go through a restorative process to respond to what we've seen. So there's lots of things that Central Virginia Community Justice has done other than those restorative processes. And that's just one example. In almost any town you are in, you can find some kind of restorative justice group. When I speak to other places and other cities, and I often say, just Google your town and restorative justice, and you'll find something right there. Sometimes restorative justice is in conjunction with the system. So Central Virginia Community Justice is its own nonprofit that the system calls on for help. Sometimes the system has that as part of its process. The problem there, though, is that restorative justice is not really voluntary. It's forced. It's go to prison or do this.
Yes.
And so restorative justice is best when it's outside the system, in the world, in the church, in the household, and informal. And CVCJ is a version of that. But there's lots of others.
That's great. Yeah.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I had a question similarly about kind of the systemic level. I mean, as Father Justin said, I'm very taken with applying a lot of this at a much more micro level of family or church. Like, I want to think more about that for sure.
Yeah.
So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah.
But at the systemic level, like, I guess my brain, maybe others, I'm having a hard time conceptualizing exactly what that looks like. So let's say someone commits a crime or harm, and enters that nonprofit, like is referred to, or however you put it, to that program outside the system. What actually happens? What does that offender and the offendee, like what actually happens? I'm having a hard time, I guess.
Sure.
And then I guess
Sure.
part B of that is, how is that scaled?
I'll answer the second part kind of quickly. As a whole, it's not, because you want there to be local expressions and nuances. So you want a local group to meet it in the way that that locality needs. So I don't want the criminal legal system to adopt a restorative approach. I don't want the government to get in and do it. I want these groups and pockets and pods to be resourced and grow to serve what they need. So it's scalable in the sense that that town over there can do something to and learn from us. But like, we're not going to build a consortium of all, keep it local. So that's that answer. So restorative justice is a spectrum too. Think of it. It can be all the way from the criminal legal system kind of tries to do it, which is really hard, all the way to it's just something that Joe and Jane do on their own, and then everything in between. Central Virginia Community Justice is kind of in the middle because they're doing it on their own and they're called on by the system. Though they take community referrals as well. Like I, living in Charlottesville, could call them and say, I've experienced harm in this way. Can you help me? And they'd be able to. Or the attorney can make that call on behalf of the case. Most groups aren't that flexible. Often they're kind of one or the other. So what it looks like most often with this is Jim Hengsley, if we're talking Albemarle County, looks at a case of some kind of harm that happened and calls up Aaron and Ashley, who helped lead it, and say, hey, I have a case that looks like it would be a good qualification for restorative justice. But that case could be anything. From there was vandalizing of a car in one instance, there was a hit and run in another instance. So it can be any kind of violent crime. I'll also say, not for CVCJ, but for restorative justice as a whole, there's not a crime that you can think of that restorative justice hasn't been applied to successfully, whatever that may be. And there's examples and incredible stories of that. So they get a call, and then their next step is to sit down separately with those two parties. It's called a pre-conference. And so they meet with the person who did the harm, and they talk with them. What happened? What kind of space are you in? Are you willing to enter into this voluntarily? Are you able to acknowledge and admit things? If that person is ready, then great. Then they meet with the other party who was harmed. What happened? Let's hear about this. What do you need to feel safe in that room? What are the conditions? Where are you sitting? Who's in there with you? All of those nuances, which sometimes can take weeks to work through.
Right.
And then you have them meet together. CVCJ typically does about 3 meetings, one with the person who did the harm, one who experienced the harm, and then one with them together. Other programs do it differently. Then they bring them into the room and they go through this restorative process, which the way it looks different is it's not set up like a courtroom, right? You don't have the defense and the prosecution. It's not oppositional. You don't have violence on the table. There's no fear of prosecution. And so it begins with not the person saying, here's what happened, here's this crime, here's the law. It begins with what happened to you. And that person names what happened to them, how they experienced it. And then there's space for the person to respond and hopefully acknowledge what it is that they did. And then the person who's the mediator, representing the community, talks through, sometimes for hours, what does healing look like? What do you need for that to not happen again? What do you need to feel safe? And they actually write out a contract. And then they go through and talk about what it looks like. And then they leave. And then over time, you're checking in and you're seeing, are those conditions met? And again, the way this program works is, then they take that back to the judge, and Jim brings it before the judge and says, this has gone through a restorative process, and it's great. And the judge says, great, this is dismissed. Go and be well. That's just one example.
Yeah, sure.
So what does the evidence say about recidivism? I can't.
Yes, you got it right.
Yeah, it's a weird word.
So offenders that have gone through this process versus gone through the tradition.
Yeah, how does it play out?
It's incomparable, the data. It's nowhere close to the same. So one, I'll say measuring recidivism is really hard. Like, what does that mean? What does it look like? How do you get people in different geographic areas? Are you talking about recidivating within a year, within 10 years? So just historically and in the data world, recidivism is really hard. But if we just mean is someone doing some kind of crime again, because remember, plenty of harm is not criminal, so that too. But what we see with all those conditions is an absolute unbelievable difference within 2 measures. One, satisfaction of both parties. Both parties overwhelmingly rate the process of saying, I prefer this over what I experienced before or what it could have been. CVCJ satisfaction rate specifically is like over 90% for both parties. Recidivism, again, is hugely different as we look at it. And each program is going to give some different data. Well, one data point that I will give is one group in New York called Calming Justice, and they engage specifically violent offenses, which almost very rarely restorative justice focuses just on that. So that's hard and good. But they talk about, when they talk with those who are harmed, over 90% of individuals, when they're offered restorative justice, want that rather than the typical route of the criminal legal system. So by any kind of measure, when you're given the option, they want that. When they experience it, they love it. When you let them go and leave the room, it's rare that they recidivate. And there's hard data on all of those points, but over and over, even though this is not scalable, those local groups are showing those same results.
Interesting. Kathy, yeah.
I can understand maybe my lack of imagination, but I understand the type of talk therapy, counseling, guidance you're giving. Are there other interventions, like maybe working a certain amount of time in a place that would give you some self-respect for what you do? Are you familiar with Eric Boyle in East LA?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are you doing, is it all done by talking, or is there other things happening too?
Mm-hmm. I love that you began with the word imagination. And I'll say that the number one hurdle in sharing this and doing this work is people having a lack of imagination for what we could do, because they just go back to what the typical is. One kind of quote unquote parable about it is that one woman named Danielle Sered does around this is she says, imagine a desert, and in the middle of the desert is a hamburger stand, and it's got a line a mile long, and you talk to everybody in the line, they said, this is the best hamburger that's around. Well, of course it is. It's the only one. It's in the middle of the desert. And she said, that's our criminal legal system. Everybody says it's the best thing around because we don't think there is another option, but there is. We don't even have to imagine it. It's happening all over the world, all throughout history, and even here within this area. So I love that it's imagination. I'd also keep in mind, it sounds like a lot of talking, and it is, hours of it, but the talking results in physical actions. So remember, that person who did the harm is called to repair. In our home, we say, I don't want you just to say sorry, I want you to do sorry. That's great that you said that with your words. Show me with your action. It means whatever the person who was harmed says that they need. And this is that moment when the criminal legal system is bound by law and confinement and prison time and mandatory sentencing. And this is where restorative justice can excel, because they can be creative to do anything. It might mean that person calls for that person to not be on the subway for a year, because that's where they were harmed and that's what they need for healing. It might be that they need a letter. It might be they need money to fix whatever it is that was gone. It might mean that they need their house repaired if the door was jimmied open. But what happens in restorative justice is it gives the space for the need to be met in the way that it actually was experienced. And that's almost always a physical act. Saying, I'm sorry, I acknowledge that, is just the beginning of it. That repair is some kind of physical action that the system can't really require. And so all those other things that you're talking about are all options. And then the biggest thing, though, is what is your intention? I can have the same intention, and something could be punishment, where I can have the same action and a different intention, and it can be because I want to change you over time.
Right.
So some of those things you're talking about, like I can have you, work out in the field, but like if I'm requiring it and paying you 25 cents a day when you're in prison, that's going to harm you further. But if I'm calling you into a space that's part of repair and you know that I care about you, that's a wholly different situation.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, Sam, but maybe you can stay around and answer any questions that other people have.
Sure.
Let's give Sam a round of applause for being with us today. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.